When we think about America in the 1920s, what usually comes to mind is the Roaring Twenties. Jazz clubs, speakeasies, flapper dresses. This would be the era Bonnie and Clyde grew up in. But that image sits against a much darker backdrop. This is true crime of the historical kind. You're listening to part one of the story of Bonnie and Clyde, Deadly Valentine. When the First World War ended in 1918, America was supposed to breathe a sigh of relief. The fighting had stopped, the troops had come home, and the country wanted to celebrate victory. People were focused on a brighter future where prosperity was just around the corner. But beneath that optimism, the ground was already shifting. Over 5 million Americans had been mobilized into the war. The ones lucky enough to return home found a nation that didn't quite know what to do with them. Jobs were inconsistent, wages were uncertain, and labor unrest flared across the country in the years immediately after the war. Industries struggled to adjust, and workers had little prospects of supporting themselves. The 1920s would become a decade of sharp contrasts. Cities expanded rapidly, fueled by new industries and mass media. Radios carried music and news into living rooms, while movies projected images of wealth and freedom. Automobiles promised independence. All you need is a car, a dirt road, and the open horizon to go anywhere you wanted to go. Not that there were many cities that could promise a better life, though advertising sold the idea that success was attainable, but for many it felt just out of reach. For many working class families, especially outside major cities, the promises of the decade went unfulfilled. At the same time, traditional authority began to feel increasingly hollow. Churches, politicians, even law enforcement seemed out of touch with everyday reality. Prohibition had been enacted in 1920 in an attempt to impose moral order from the top down, but instead it revealed just how fragile law enforcement could be. Bootleggers, smugglers, and organized crime flourished, and the law increasingly appeared negotiable, unevenly enforced, if not openly corrupt. Criminals began to look less like villains and more like rebels, especially to the people who were struggling just to get by. People were fascinated by speed, celebrity, and defiance. As the 20s wore on, the country's true economic state began to show. When the stock market crashed in 1929, it marked the beginning of a collapse that would erase more than half of the market's value over the next several years, taking any last hopes of prosperity with it. The 1930s would soon prove it would never be the golden days people had been promised. Instead, they became the dark years of the Great Depression. For millions of Americans, it didn't matter if you followed all the rules. Families who had done everything right still lost jobs, their homes, and their savings. And the loss wasn't only financial, it carried shame, anger, and a growing sense of betrayal. The country looked to its president, Herbert Hoover, for reassurance. Hoover had come into office in 1929 with a reputation as a problem solver. As a former mining engineer and an internationally respected humanitarian, he believed deeply in efficiency, expertise, and voluntary cooperation. He promised that the federal government could stabilize the crisis without dismantling the foundations of American capitalism. President Hoover insisted the downturn was temporary. Recovery, he argued, could come through private enterprise, local action, and individual responsibility, not sweeping federal intervention. But for the average working class family or the unemployed, those promises rang false. Banks failed, credit vanished, evictions mounted. State and local governments were quickly overwhelmed, and federal relief remained limited and conditional. By the early 1930s, the gap between political reassurance and daily reality had become so wide that Hoover's talk of patience and restraint meant nothing when it clashed with visible suffering. As homelessness spread, shanty towns began to form on the outskirts of cities. people began to call these makeshift communities Hoovervilles. They were filled with those searching for work, relief, or simply for a place to sleep. Meanwhile, in rural America, for a time, many believed that what was happening on Wall Street wouldn't reach them. Yet, in time, that would not be the case. Across the South and the Midwest, agriculture communities were hit hard, especially in Texas. Texas was still largely agrarian. Its economy depended on farming, livestock, and seasonal labor. People here were used to hardship. Life already felt like it couldn't get any harder. Tenant farmers and sharecroppers lived on the thinnest of margins. They were always one bad season away from disaster. So, as credit disappeared and crops failed, landowners found themselves under pressure and began evicting families. Banks reclaimed homes and farms that had been held for generations. Entire communities were being uprooted, drifting from one place to the next in search of work that often didn't exist. At the same time, the systems meant to maintain order were breaking down. Law enforcement was local, underfunded, and poorly coordinated. Jurisdiction ended at county lines, and criminals knew it. Not to mention, culturally, the line between criminal and citizen had already been blurred. Prohibition had normalized everyday lawbreaking. As desperation deepened and respect for authority had lessened, a familiar figure emerged: the American outlaw. Much like legends of the Old West, a new kind of antihero took shape. Newspapers that offered distraction soon filled their pages with sensationalized crime stories. Photographs and headlines of criminals were everywhere in what's referred to as the public enemy era. American outlaws and gangsters like John Dillinger, Machine Gun Kelly, Pretty Boy Floyd, Al Capone, and Bonnie and Clyde became infamous. So, how did Bonnie and Clyde become one of the most famous partners in crime in American history? Well, we have to look back on their experience in the world I just described. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born on March 24th, 1909, near Tellico, Texas. Clyde was one of seven children born into a poor family. The Barrows were tenant farmers, which could be a precarious existence even in good years. The family moved frequently, following work and opportunity, and lived with persistent financial instability. Clyde grew up alongside his brothers and sisters in close quarters, sharing both labor and hardship from an early age. As tenant farming became increasingly untenable, the Barrow family relocated from rural Ellis County to a poor part of West Dallas. At first, they lived under a wagon, using it as shelter until their circumstances improved. They eventually settled in an industrial suburb where multiple Barrow children worked to help support the household. Clyde's older brother Buck Barrow would later become a part of Clyde's criminal career, but during their childhood, Buck and the other Barrow children were part of a tightly knit family unit navigating poverty together. Clyde left school after completing only a few grades and began working as a teenager. He and his brothers took whatever manual labor they could find, including factory and industrial work that was common in West Dallas. His education would remain limited, and legitimate opportunities for advancement were scarce. Clyde was surrounded by the kinds of petty crime that were common in such neighborhoods. That led to early encounters with the law during his teenage years, mostly consisting of small thefts and burglaries. He was first arrested at 17 for failing to return a rented car, then for stealing turkeys. Bonnie's childhood would also come with difficulties. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born on October 1st, 1910. She was born in a small town in West Texas called Rowena. She was the middle child of three siblings, born into a working class family. Families like the Parkers depended on practical skills, reliable wages, and cooperation at home. Yet that was upended when, at only 4 years old, her father died. He had worked as a bricklayer, but now it would be up to Bonnie's mother to find a way to support the family. To do that, she would soon move the family to Cement City, which was an industrial area of what is now West Dallas. There, Bonnie's mother did her best to support her children by working as a seamstress. The work was tedious and often poorly paid, but it was all they had. Bonnie grew up wanting to be an actress. She was expressive and charming and seemed to show an early aptitude for writing. She wrote poetry from a young age. It became a hobby that continued into adulthood. Like many young women of her social class, Bonnie's options were limited. As a teenager, she worked small part time jobs, then married a man named Roy Thornton at only 15 years old. Young marriages were a path that was common for women with little access to higher education or professional opportunity. But this marriage didn't last. After less than a year, Roy and Bonnie separated. The marriage was over, though it was never legally dissolved because divorce would have been expensive, so they simply parted ways. In January of 1930, Bonnie and Clyde had a chance meeting for the first time at a friend's house in West Dallas. Bonnie was 19 years old and Clyde was 20. By all accounts, the relationship developed quickly. Right from the start, the two were inseparable. But that didn't mean Clyde had any intention of staying out of trouble. Soon after they met, he was arrested for auto theft and sent to jail. But Bonnie would visit Clyde frequently. Visitors in jail were common, and supervision was lax as security procedures were far from standardized. At some point during these visits, Bonnie managed to smuggle a gun into the jail. Accounts differ on the exact method. Some suggest it was concealed on her person, others that it was hidden among items brought inside. But she somehow got the small handgun to Clyde. And he used it. Clyde held guards at gunpoint and forced his way out of the jail and escaped custody. Clyde was now a fugitive, but that would be short lived. He was quickly recaptured, and now the consequences were more severe. Clyde now faced hard time in the Texas prison system. He was transferred to the Easton Prison Farm, which was a state run penal labor camp in Texas. Working farms, as they were called, operated with forced inmate labor and were overseen by armed guards in harsh conditions. If prisoners didn't want to work in the fields, they were met with violence and discipline. Contemporary reports and later testimony describe Eastham as one of the most brutal facilities in the Texas system during this period. During his time there, Clyde was subjected to severe abuse, both physical and sexual. This would create a hatred of the Texas prison system within Clyde that ran so deep, many believe this was his motivator to his future crimes. Sometime after the assault, it said Clyde killed his attacker by bashing his head in with a pipe, though another prisoner formally took responsibility for it. If true, this was more than likely Clyde's first murder. But there's no denying that his experience in prison shaped him. One friend later commented that they saw Clyde go into prison a boy and come out a rattlesnake. Clyde was so desperate to leave the hard labor of the prison farm that he cut off two of his own toes, essentially disabling himself so that he would be unfit for the fields. It was a crude method, but it worked. Clyde was transferred out of the field work, and with the help of his mother's petition, he was paroled shortly after. Though the cost was steep, he would be left with a permanent limp. Not long after his release, Clyde was reunited with Bonnie. Naturally, the two wanted to get as far away as they could get. All they needed to do was steal a car and be on their way. By the late 1920s and into the early 30s, automobiles had fundamentally changed how Americans moved through the country. For the first time, long distance travel was no longer limited to railroads or fixed schedules. Cars offered a new kind of individualized freedom. A person could leave town quietly, travel overnight, and cross multiple jurisdictions before morning. With the mass production of automobiles, most notably vehicles like the Ford Motor Company's Model T and Model A, had made cars relatively affordable, even for working class families. Gas cost around 10 to 20 cents per gallon, which with inflation is relatively similar to what we pay today. State and federal investment in highways during the 1920s expanded paved routes across the Midwest and South, which meant small gas stations would spring up alongside. They were usually operated as family businesses. These roads connected small towns, rural communities, and industrial centers in ways that hadn't existed a generation earlier. For fugitives, it meant evading heat from lawmen by sheer stretch of distance and jurisdiction. On the road, strangers were common because the whole country seemed to be experiencing waves of transience as thousands of Americans were already drifting in search of work. So, together, Bonnie and Clyde began traveling through Texas and into neighboring states, moving from place to place, robbing, then disappearing on the open road. It wasn't long before they began to collect a loose group of associates. These were men who would join Bonnie and Clyde for a short period of time, then drift away or be replaced as they served time. This band of thieves would eventually become known as the Barrow Gang. One such person was Ralph Fultz, who had been in prison with Clyde. One of the first initiatives was to get enough supplies to raid Easton Prison. At first, Bonnie was sort of along for the ride, but she knew what the risks of being involved with Clyde were. And, of course, in time, it would become her turn to get arrested. On April 19th, 1932, Bonnie and Ralph were arrested in Kaufman, Texas. They were caught in an attempted burglary of a hardware store, trying to steal firearms. When law enforcement intervened, Bonnie and Ralph were taken into custody. While in jail, Bonnie spent her time writing poetry and waiting until she could get back on the road with Clyde. On the outside, Clyde stayed busy. He and a man named Raymond Hamilton were attempting to rob a store in Hillsboro, Texas, when things turned deadly. During the course of the robbery, the shopkeeper named J.N. Booker was shot and killed. In the aftermath, the victim's wife identified Clyde as the gunman, placing Clyde directly at the center of the killing. Though later findings would indicate Clyde was actually the getaway driver. Regardless, he'd have to get caught to get arrested. In June, just a couple months after her arrest, Bonnie was let free. Lawmen tried to form a case against her, but a jury failed to indict her. So, once released, Bonnie quickly rejoined Clyde and the Barrow Gang. Fultz, however, wasn't so lucky. He ended up serving real time and never rejoined the gang. Bonnie, on the other hand, returned to the road knowing she was now a full participant in the gang, not just a companion. What follows is a pattern of driving at night, hiding out, drifting from one small town to the next, looking for opportunities to rob people, then disappear into the night. But that, of course, came with major risks. On a hot August night, Clyde and members of the group were in Oklahoma, drinking moonshine in a parking lot when they were approached by lawmen. Reportedly, Clyde and members of the gang opened fire, killing Deputy Eugene C. Moore and wounding Sheriff C. G. Maxwell. It was a reckless waste of life, but it shows the gang would kill on the spot, no questions asked, making them more than just thieves. They were cold-blooded killers. The shootout in Oklahoma did little to discourage the Barrow Gang's violence. If anything, it upped the ante. They'd be more paranoid, more suspicious of people calling law enforcement on them. In turn, civilians would be extremely wary of outsiders and suspicious behavior. For the gang, they knew they'd either be killed or sent to prison for life if they were to be caught. So, every encounter with police was kill or be killed. For much of the early criminal activity, the Barrow Gang operated below the level of national attention. The crimes of small robberies, stolen cars, break ins were not unusual in the early years of the Depression. Local newspapers would mention the events but had not yet distinguished between several bands of robbers. But that was starting to change. The group was being linked to a growing number of thefts and armed robberies across Texas and neighboring states. Witnesses' descriptions were inconsistent, but one name began appearing more frequently: Clyde Barrow. Yet the gang had no intention of slowing down. In October of that same year, another robbery would end in tragedy. This time, it was a store owner in Sherman, Texas, named Howard Hall. Later historical accounts attribute the killing to the gang as a whole, while other historians have questioned whether Clyde was present at the scene or whether another associate fired the fatal shot. And it could be confusing on purpose. Because it would be too conspicuous for the entire gang to move together, they would often break off in pairs or in threes, then return to the group after a crime was committed. So it could be unclear who was doing what. And the members were constantly coming and going. On Christmas Eve, a teenage boy named W.D. Jones joined Bonnie and Clyde in Dallas, Texas. Jones was only 16 years old, but he had known the Barrows since childhood. Just one day after joining the gang, W.D. was involved in a battle. On Christmas Day in 1932, the gang found themselves in Temple, Texas. They were looking to steal an automobile, and in that attempt, the owner, Doyle Johnson, just a young family man, was shot and killed. By the time lawmen were on the scene, the gang was long gone. There was just no way to know which direction the gang were headed. Just weeks later, on January 6th of 1933, some of the gang wandered into a trap, which may have been set for another dangerous group. Deputies positioned themselves with the expectation that this would be a controlled encounter, one that might finally end in an arrest of a criminal. Instead, it unraveled almost immediately. Gunfire broke out. In the exchange, Malcolm Davis, a deputy sheriff from Tarrant County, was struck and killed. The Barrow Gang once again escaped. Each death brought more heat onto the traveling automobile gang. But it was clear that communication between counties and states had to improve. With this sort of threat to the public, police needed a more collaborative system, like on the federal level. By early 1933, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, was still a relatively limited force. It did not have the broad powers that it would later claim. Most violent crimes, like murder and robbery, remained state matters. The agency was led by J. Edgar Hoover, not to be confused with the President Herbert Hoover of no relation. J. Edgar Hoover was in the process of professionalizing the Bureau, tightening discipline, expanding fingerprint files, and promoting centralized record keeping. But coordination remained uneven and slow. It was high-profile criminals like Bonnie and Clyde who exposed the gaps between local jurisdictions, representing both a challenge and an opportunity. These cases were beginning to justify a larger federal role in American law enforcement. But until then, lawmen were going to have to figure out how they were going to capture this automobile gang. Because one thing was for certain: Bonnie and Clyde would not go down without a fight. This was True Crime of the Historical Kind. Thank you so much for listening. There will be a part 2 next week. As many of you know, this is a new podcast, and to be honest, I just haven't had the time to promote it or do any type of advertising yet. I'm surprised people have even found it in the first place. But I'm glad that you have, and if you feel so inclined, maybe sending this to somebody who you think might like it, or just liking, following, maybe a positive review. Anything you're willing to do would be so helpful. Otherwise, just happy you're here. Until next time, bye.